The dust of redemption gulch tasted of grit and despair, a fine powder that settled on every surface and soured the back of the throat. It clung to the rough spun shift they had forced upon her, a garment of shame that did little to ward off the merciless glare of the sun or the far more painful glare of the assembled crowd. On the crude wooden platform, Nita stood as still as the granite bluffs that watched over the valley, her spirit a tight, cold knot in her chest. She had learned long ago that stillness was a form of armor. If she did not move, did not react, perhaps she could pretend this was not happening to her. The auctioneer, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, droned on, his voice a greasy litany of her supposed attributes. Strong back, good teeth, knows her place, he barked, gesturing to her as if she were a mule or a broodmare. A wave of nausea rolled through her. They did not know her name. They did not care to. To them, she was merely the Apache girl, a piece of property, a spoil of a war she had no part in. The crowd was a collection of hard-faced men and grim-lipped women, their eyes a mixture of cruel curiosity and weary indifference. No one bid. The initial novelty had worn off, leaving behind the uncomfortable reality of what they were doing. A woman from the mission school might fetch a price as a domestic servant, but an Apache? She was too wild, too foreign, a symbol of the very wilderness they sought to tame and fence in. From the corner of her eye, she saw him. Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, leaned against a support post, a gold tooth glinting in his sneer. He was the one who had bought the contract on the prisoners, the one who saw profit in human misery. He made no move to bid, content to watch her humiliation unfold, a predator enjoying his sport. The auctioneer was growing desperate. "Come now, gentlemen. A bargain at any price." Silence answered him, thick and heavy. The sun beat down. Nita focused on the distant mountains, their peaks hazy in the heat. They were her only home now, a memory of freedom she could no longer touch. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. The auctioneer's sweaty face fell, his professional bluster deflating into sour resignation. "Very well," he sighed, ready to motion for the guards to drag her away, her value deemed less than nothing. It was then that Silas Croft pushed himself off the post, his movements deliberately slow and arrogant. He did not raise his hand, but simply let his voice, slick with contempt, slide over the silent crowd. "I'll give you $5 for her," he drawled, the words dripping with malice. "She can scrub the floors at the bunkhouse. The boys will appreciate the view." A few coarse chuckles broke the tension, but they died quickly. The offer was not a bid, it was the final nail in the coffin of her dignity, an insult designed to brand her as worthless chattel for the basest of uses. A cold dread, sharper than any fear she had yet felt, pierced through Nita's carefully constructed armor. The world narrowed to Croft's leering face, the finality of her fate sealing around her like a shroud. But before the auctioneer could accept the debased offer, another voice cut through the oppressive heat. $100. The words were not shouted, but spoken with a low, resonant authority that commanded instant attention. They were clear, precise, and utterly unexpected. Every head in the dusty street swiveled toward the back of the crowd. A man stood there, half hidden in the long shadow of the livery stable. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in the dusty denim of a rancher but in the worn buckskins of a man who lived apart from towns. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the severe set of his jaw. His eyes, fixed on the platform, were the color of a winter's sky, cold and piercing. Elias Thorne. The name rippled through the onlookers in hushed whispers. The Mountain Man. The recluse who lived alone in the high country, a ghost from a past the town preferred to forget. Croft's sneer tightened into a scowl. "Thorne," he spat. "What's a hermit like you want with her?" Elias ignored him, his gaze never leaving the auctioneer. $100. In gold. The auctioneer, stunned, gaped for a moment before his greed overcame his surprise. "I have 100. Do I hear 150? Croft's face purpled with rage. He had been publicly challenged. 110, he snapped. 200, Elias said immediately, his voice flat and unwavering. A gasp went through the crowd. It was a fortune, more than a man might make in a year. Croft was beaten. He could afford it, but the price was now one of pride, and he could see in Thorne's implacable stare that this was a battle he would not win today. He gave a curt, vicious shake of his head and retreated into the crowd, muttering threats. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel. "To Mr. Thorne." Elias moved forward, the crowd parting before him as if he were a force of nature. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the table, the clink of coin final and absolute. Then, he turned and walked toward the platform, his expression as unreadable as the stone mountains he called home. The journey away from Redemption Gulch was a silent ordeal. Elias Thorne untied her hands with a cold efficiency that offered no comfort, his fingers brushing her wrists with a touch as impersonal as the wind. He gestured toward a sturdy-looking mare tethered nearby, its reins held loosely in his large, calloused hand. He did not offer to help her mount, but simply waited, his patience a palpable, unnerving presence. Nita swung herself into the saddle, her movement stiff with exhaustion and fear. He mounted his own horse, a powerful grey gelding, and set off without a word, leading her horse by a rope. They rode east, toward the rising spine of the mountains that clawed at the sky. The town and its stench of cruelty fell away behind them, but Nita felt no relief, only a profound sense of dislocation. She had been traded from one cage to another, the nature of this new one still terrifyingly unknown. Her new owner was a cipher, a wall of stoic silence. He rode ahead of her, his back a rigid line of muscle and buckskin. He moved with the quiet competence of a man entirely at home in the wilderness, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, missing nothing. Hours bled into one another under the relentless sun. The terrain grew harsher, the gentle roll of the plains giving way to rocky inclines and groves of whispering aspen. Once, he stopped by a small, clear-running creek. He dismounted, filled a canteen, and handed it up to her. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second, and in the depths of his winter-grey eyes, she saw not cruelty, but a profound and desolate emptiness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. She drank the cool water, the simple act of mercy a confusing counterpoint to her fear. He was not like Croft. He had not leered or threatened. But his silence was a different kind of threat, a void she could not read or anticipate. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Why had a man who lived alone paid a fortune for a woman he would not even speak to? As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Elias's inner world was a storm of its own. What have I done? The question echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. He had seen the girl on that platform, her defiant stillness a beacon in a sea of ugliness, and something inside him, a dormant piece of the man he used to be, had snapped. He could not stand by. But now, the consequences of his impulsive act rode behind him. She was a reminder of a world he had forsaken, a life he had lost. Every rustle of her horse's hooves was an accusation. They reached his homestead as the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to a deep, star-dusted darkness. The cabin was nestled in a small, high meadow valley, flanked by towering pines and the stark grey face of a mountain. It was not a welcoming sight. The structure was solid, built of thick, dark logs, but it had an air of profound neglect, as if the man who lived within had long since ceased to care about comfort. The wood was weathered and unpainted, the stone chimney was crumbling slightly at the top, and the small porch sagged on one end. It was a fortress of solitude, a physical manifestation of the man's soul. Elias dismounted and, with the same detached competence, took the reins of her horse. He led the animals toward a small, dark barn, the sounds of his movements echoing in the immense silence of the high country. Nita slid from the saddle, her legs trembling from the long ride. She stood alone in the clearing, a small, lost figure in an overwhelming wilderness. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. When Elias returned, he carried a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows. "This way," he said, the first words he had spoken to her in hours. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse. He led her to the cabin's single door and pushed it open. The interior was sparse and shadowed, containing little more than a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a single cot. He did not invite her into the main room. Instead, he gestured toward a small door to the side, clearly leading to a storage room or pantry. "You will stay in here." He unlocked it and opened it, revealing a cramped, windowless space, empty save for a pile of clean blankets and a water skin. He placed the lantern on the floor just inside the main cabin, its light barely penetrating the smaller room's gloom, along with a plate of jerky and hardtack. He then stepped back, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Nita hesitated, then moved past him into the small, dark room. The heavy wooden door closed behind her. She heard the scrape of a metal bolt sliding into place. He had locked her in. She sank onto the blankets, a wave of confusion washing over her fear. This was not the act of a man who had bought her for pleasure. This was the act of a jailer, a man who wanted to contain her, to keep her separate. The lock was a wall between them, and in a way she could not yet understand, it felt as much for his protection as for hers. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Each morning, Nita would awaken to find the bolt on her door drawn back. A simple meal of bread and dried meat would be on the table in the main room, along with a fresh bucket of water. The man, Elias, would already be gone, disappearing into the vast wilderness that surrounded his homestead at first light. She would watch him from the cabin's single dusty window as he worked. He moved with a relentless, punishing energy, mending fences, chopping wood, tending to his horses, his body a study in controlled force. He was a man at war with his own land, or perhaps with himself, seeking to exhaust his body to quiet his mind. He never looked toward the cabin. He never acknowledged her presence. She was a ghost in his home, a witness to his solitary penance. In the beginning, Nita stayed inside, a prisoner held by invisible bars of fear and uncertainty. But the silence and confinement began to gnaw at her. Slowly, cautiously, she began to venture out. At first, just onto the sagging porch, then into the small clearing. She expected him to shout, to order her back inside, but he did nothing. His indifference was her permission. She found a small, neglected patch of earth near the cabin where a few hardy herbs struggled for life. One of them, a variety of mountain sage she recognized, was withering, its leaves yellow and dry. An instinct, deep and ingrained, took over. She found a shard of wood to loosen the soil, carefully removed the weeds choking its roots, and used her cupped hands to bring it water from the bucket. It was a small, simple act, but it felt like a reclamation of herself. She was not just a captive, she was a person with knowledge, with skill. One evening, as the sun bled behind the peaks, Elias returned from his work, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He stopped short when he saw her kneeling by the herb patch, her fingers gently tending the ailing plant. He said nothing, but his customary path to the cabin door wavered. For a long moment, he simply stood and watched her, his expression a complex mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper she could not decipher. He saw not the Apache girl from the auction block, but a woman trying to nurture life in a place that had long been barren. That night, when she went to her small room, she noticed the heavy metal bolt on the outside of the door was gone, the screw holes empty and dark in the wood. He had removed it. It was not an invitation, but it was a concession. It was the first fragile seed of trust, planted in the hard, unforgiving ground of their shared solitude. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for weeks, began to curdle. Great bruises of grey and purple massed over the western peaks, and a low, mournful wind began to keen through the pines. A storm was coming, one that mirrored the roiling unrest that had been building within the silent cabin. Elias worked with a feverish intensity to secure the homestead, his movements sharp and urgent as he shuttered the barn and reinforced a loose section of the roof. Nita found herself helping without being asked, gathering loose tools and stacking firewood on the porch, the shared task creating a temporary, unspoken alliance against the coming fury of the elements. The first crack of thunder sent a tremor through the ground, and the heavens opened. Rain fell in a solid, blinding sheet. They retreated into the cabin, the sudden proximity in the small space feeling charged and dangerous. A violent gust of wind tore at the barn door, ripping a hinge from its mooring. With a muttered curse, Elias grabbed a hammer and rope, plunging back out into the maelstrom. Nita watched from the doorway, her heart pounding in time with the thunder as he fought the thrashing door in the deluge. A splintered board, ripped loose by the wind, caught him high on the arm, and he staggered back with a sharp cry of pain. He managed to lash the door shut before stumbling back to the cabin, soaked to the bone and clutching his arm, blood flowing freely from a deep, ragged gash. The sight of his injury broke through Nita's reserve. She saw not her captor, but a man in need. "Sit," she commanded, her voice firm, surprising them both. He sank onto a stool by the hearth, his face pale. She moved quickly, her fear replaced by a focused purpose. She tore a strip from one of the clean blankets he had given her and located the small pouch of herbs she had managed to save, the one she had been tending outside. With practiced hands, she crushed yarrow leaves to stem the bleeding and cleaned the wound with water she heated by the fire. As she worked, her touch gentle but sure, the tense silence between them finally fractured. "They said I betrayed my people," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the howl of the storm. "A white trapper came to our camp. He warned me that soldiers were coming, that we should move. I tried to tell the elders, but they had seen me speaking to him before. They believed I was a collaborator, that I had given our position away. They cast me out just before the soldiers came. That is how I was captured." She finished bandaging his arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I tried to save them." Elias sat utterly still as she spoke, the physical pain in his arm a dull ache compared to the sharp resonance of her words. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the profound injustice she had suffered etched into the dignified lines of her face. The storm raged outside, a perfect chorus to the tempest of memory her confession had unleashed within him. He had spent 5 years building walls around his heart, stone by stone, until it was a fortress as impenetrable as the mountain peaks outside. Her quiet courage, her gentle care in the face of his own coldness, had just found the one crack in its foundation. His gaze drifted past her to the rough-hewn mantel over the hearth. Upon it sat a single, small object, a wooden bird, crudely but lovingly carved, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. He reached out with his good hand and picked it up, his thumb tracing the worn, smooth lines. "My daughter, Lily, carved this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "She was 6. She loved birds." Nita waited, her own sorrow held in abeyance, sensing that this was a dam about to break. "My wife, Sarah, had hair the color of autumn leaves. She filled this cabin with wildflowers," and with laughter he stared into the fire, but his eyes were seeing a different time, a different life. "I was a trapper then. Gone for weeks at a time. I was up on the North Ridge, checking my lines, when the raiders came. They were after horses, nothing more. But Sarah, she would not be intimidated." His voice broke, and a single tear, hot and sharp, traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "When I got back, there was only this." He held up the small wooden bird. "Smoke, and silence. I wasn't here to protect them. My wife, my child, they paid the price for my absence." He finally looked at Nita, his soul-deep guilt and grief laid bare in his wintry eyes. "This land is all I have left of them. I stay because leaving feels like burying them a second time." In that moment, the last vestiges of their former roles, captor and captive, buyer and bought, dissolved in a shared atmosphere of profound loss. They were simply two people, shipwrecked by life, who had found a splinter of driftwood to cling to in the same storm. The storm passed, leaving the high country washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. A fragile peace settled over the homestead, a quiet understanding that needed no words. Nita began to cultivate her herb garden with more purpose, and Elias started long-neglected repairs on the cabin, his movements less frantic, more deliberate. He was no longer just working, he was rebuilding. They ate their meals together at the rough table, the silence between them no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with a comfortable, healing quiet. But the world beyond their mountain sanctuary had not forgotten them. One afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the valley, sharp and unwelcome. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, led by Silas Croft. He sat astride his fine black stallion, his face a mask of smug superiority. His men, brutish and armed, flanked him. "Thorn," Croft called out, his voice oily with false cordiality. "I came to check on my property." His eyes flickered meaningfully toward Nita, who stood frozen near the cabin door. Elias moved to stand in front of her, his body a solid shield. "She is not your property," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you are not welcome on my land." Croft laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Your land? Don't be foolish. The survey is complete. This entire valley, including the spring that feeds it, falls within the boundaries of my new acquisition from the railroad company. You, my friend, are a squatter." It was a lie, a blatant power play, but the threat was clear. "I have a legal deed," Elias stated, his hand inching toward the axe handle that leaned against the cabin wall. "Deeds can get lost. Fires happen," Croft said, his smile sharpening into a predatory grin. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'll overlook your trespassing. All I want is the girl. She's stolen goods, after all. Give her to me, and you can stay." Anita's blood ran cold. This was not about land, it was about power, about humiliating the man who had bested him at the auction. Elias did not even glance back at her. His focus was entirely on Croft, his stance rooted and immovable. "You will leave now," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "And you will not come back." Croft's face darkened with fury at the dismissal. "This isn't over, Thorn. You'll regret crossing me. You and your Apache whore will be burned out of here before the first snow." With a vicious tug on his reins, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind. The peaceful quiet of the valley had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by the chilling certainty of a coming war. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. A new tension settled between Elias and Nita, but this time it was not of mistrust, but of shared dread. Elias began to work with a grim purpose, fortifying the homestead, barring the barn door at night, and keeping his rifle always within reach. He taught Nita how to load and fire the weapon, his hands briefly covering hers as he showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder. The touch was practical, born of necessity, yet it sent a current of awareness through both of them, a reminder of the life they were fighting to protect. Nita, in turn, used her knowledge of the land. She showed Elias hidden game trails that could serve as escape routes and pointed out plants that could be used to create irritating smoke if burned. She was no longer a passive victim waiting for her fate, she was an active defender of the home they had inadvertently built together. The attack came on a moonless night, just as Croft had promised. The first sign was the acrid smell of burning hay, followed by an ominous orange glow from the direction of the barn. "Stay inside," Elias ordered, his face a granite mask in the dim light of the cabin as he grabbed his rifle. But Nita shook her head, her jaw set with a resolve that mirrored his own. "This is my fight, too." He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened woman from the auction but a warrior, and gave a single, sharp nod. They moved out into the darkness together. Two of Croft's men were splashing oil on the barn walls, their faces illuminated by the growing flames. Elias fired a warning shot over their heads, the rifle's report cracking through the night. The men scattered, firing blindly into the darkness. While Elias pinned them down, drawing their fire, Nita slipped away, using the shadows and terrain as she had been taught since childhood. She circled around behind the men, armed with a heavy branch she had pulled from the woodpile. With a fierce cry that was part Apache war cry, part a desperate woman's roar, she brought the branch down hard across the back of one of the men, sending him sprawling to the ground. The second man whirled around, surprised, giving Elias the opening he needed. He charged from the darkness, slamming into the man and disarming him in a short, brutal struggle. At that moment, Croft himself appeared from behind the burning barn, a pistol leveled at Elias's back. "It's over, Thorn," but before he could fire, the sound of multiple horses thundering into the valley filled the air. A voice boomed, "Silas Croft! Drop your weapon! You are under arrest for arson and attempted murder." The town sheriff, accompanied by Dr. Cole and a few deputized citizens, rode into the clearing, their lanterns cutting through the smoke. Sarah Blackwood, the elderly postmistress, had sent for them after seeing Croft and his men ride out of town, her suspicions aroused. Trapped and outnumbered, Croft's face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred before he threw his gun down in disgust. The immediate danger was over. In the aftermath, a controlled chaos descended upon the homestead. The doctor, Abram Cole, tended to a shallow graze on Elias's temple while the sheriff and his men bound Croft and his thugs, extinguishing the last of the fire that had thankfully only managed to char the barn's outer wall. Amid the flurry of activity, Elias and Nita found each other. They stood near the cabin porch, the rising sun casting a pale, clean light over the valley, the smoke-stained air already beginning to clear. The ordeal had stripped away the last of their defenses, leaving them emotionally raw and exposed. Elias reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than impersonal necessity or urgent instruction. It was a touch that spoke of reverence, of wonder, of a profound gratitude that went far beyond the battle they had just won. "Nita," he said, and the simple act of speaking her name aloud felt like a vow. It was not the name of a captive or a possession, but the name of the woman who had stood beside him, who had fought for him, who had brought life back into his desolate world. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as a wave of overwhelming relief washed over her. She was safe. She was home. An epilogue found them a year later, as the first snow of the season began to dust the high peaks. The cabin was changed. A new room had been added, its windows bright and clean. The porch no longer sagged, and in front of it, a garden, now dormant under a protective layer of straw, had flourished all summer under Nita's expert care. The scars on the barn had been mended with fresh-cut timber, a testament to their resilience. Elias stood on the porch, his arm wrapped securely around Nita's waist as they watched the gentle snowfall. The haunted, empty look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He was no longer the town ghost, the reclusive mountain man. He was a husband, a partner, a man who had found a reason to rebuild. He leaned down and kissed her, a tender and familiar gesture. In the ashes of their separate, broken pasts, they had built more than just a home. They had forged a new life, a sanctuary of hope and healing, proving that even in the harshest of wildernesses, the most resilient things could grow.